book. Oh, get this out of my way. Um, I guess kind of in no particular order, although I kind of wanted to save this question, but you were talking about the structure of the book very helpfully. And I guess to maybe, unless you have it in a better way, I wanted to share with everyone the table of contents. Oh, the sharing's not turned on. Just to show everyone, because you had spoken about how the book is more or less chronological in its
Yes.
structure. Um, but it's not it's not a kind of like a timeline. It's not like it's like in 1789 and 1790, like you kind of you have a more lively, yeah. Um,
I don't know if you can see.
I think I have, let's see if I can, this shares on.
Okay.
People see this now. I have it on 2 pages from the Penguin
Oh,
website.
okay.
Um, Yeah, so I mean, if for people who are not familiar, and Evan, please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this. That's what I want you to talk about, is we have this kind of chronological order, more or less, with these kind of interstitial pieces. And I was kind of wondering if you could speak about how you arrived at structuring the book, like how you made this choice, which I liked. I mean, this is not a challenging
Yeah.
question. I kind of, if you could speak more about how it came about that with this idea.
Well, yeah, it was a hard thing to figure out. So to me, the idea of writing a history of the bookstore in America seemed gargantuan and so sweeping, and my previous books were smaller and much more narrow. And I thought originally of framing this book in a more narrow way, either geographically or chronologically or both. So, and then when I first started to think about the book, I one obvious way was just to kind of proceed chronologically and say the first chapter is, the colonial scene and then the revolution and early America, and just kind of highlight key changes and bring in some examples. But I sort of like getting a little deeper and profiling people and places more. So I tried to think of how to find representative stores that I could use as anchors in each chapter to tell a broader story about what's happening at the time. But even that made it hard to fit in all the kind of stories that I wanted to include. And so I had this idea of including these interludes as almost like nice little breaks between the chapter that could be more playful and often lighthearted and shed light on characters or themes that might have been underplayed. So if you work in a bookstore, you appreciate how important the UPS driver is, for example, but isn't something that people necessarily would ever think about. The smells of the bookstore, bookstore cats, what's it like growing up in a bookstore. I thought these would be just fun, small, yeah, interludes, little breaks between the chapter that could introduce, and they are intended to kind of echo the theme of the preceding chapter. So, you can see here there's Oscar Wilde, which is this gay bookstore and an activist. And then I have this little interlude about Mitch Kaplan, who has a Florida independent bookstore mini chain, but his whole point was to make this like a community hub. Drum and Spears, this black bookstore, and then I highlight this modern bookstore in white, very white West Virginia, where the white owners have books on race, and there's this guy who comes in who will never buy it, but he sees it. And so there's some kind of, themes about race and book selling that echo again, but it's really intended to be a kind of relief and fun and playful and interesting kind of diversion. And I really enjoyed it, and I hope to do this in all of my future books in some way, because it was fun for me to be able to think about being creative and sort of, yeah, trying to keep the reader engaged and include more material without messing with the structure, which was very hard for
Yeah,
me
and
to
I
wrap
get
my head around.
And I guess in that vein, I go, what was the most, except, I think we all have this experience when we do research on book sellings, but what was the most surprising detail you learned over the course of writing the book?
Um, So it may have the guy who started Oscar Wilde, his name was Craig Rodwell, and I mentioned how he wasn't much of a reader. So he has his papers at the New York Public Library, and I went through all of them, and he's an interesting character. And one of the things this was kind of amusing and surprising was that he habitually failed English class. Like that was his worst subject. And he has these report cards of his teachers. Um, this is just like the least likely person to become a bookseller. And we have this idea of what a bookseller is as a kind of erudite or at least smart, maybe introverted, sweater wearing glasses person. But here was this plucky, courageous, bold guy who hardly read anything, who started one of the most fascinating bookstores in the country. So um that was fun. I liked that. And just seeing the human side of these people. So I write about Frances Steloff, who also wasn't necessarily a huge reader. She had never read, apparently, James Joyce, and her bookstore became the headquarters for the James Joyce Society. And she stuck her neck out, when his books were banned and all this. And she never read him or seemed to have any real interest or appreciation for his kind of, what he was doing artistically. And she's just like reading the personal papers and the Christmas cards and letters. You just see how strange we all are as human beings. And it's fun to read these people as human beings who, um, yeah, have their own interests and desires and defy what we might think of as a stereotypical bookseller.
So my next question is kind of in the vein of structure, but it's more about audience, and it's going to also serve as a plug for your other two books. So in your previous two books, which you had alluded to before, the Cycling City, Bicycles in Urban America in the 1890s, and On Bicycles, a 200-year history of cycling in New York City. Um, is it they're both published by university presses. They seem to have an academic audience. I mean, they do have an academic audience. But just in kind of my limited reading of them, they don't come across as like overly dense monographs, these kind of real like kind of obscure reads that are kind of designed for small audiences. And that I mean that complimentarily, by the way, but they're very readable. But even as they're kind of like, and all the markers of them are that they are monographs. But the Bookshop, your current book, is obviously intended for a broader audience. And I know you've spoken about this a bit, but is this rooted in how you approached writing your previous books? In other words, could you speak to how you think about audience when you're writing?
Yeah. So I think, like most of us, I was in graduate school and I was so desperate to sound smart and impress my professors and peers and get things published that I wrote a lot of gobbledygook and used a lot of big words and employed a lot of theoretical frames. And I'm embarrassed mostly about that work. Thankfully, that doesn't appear in many places. There's a couple of articles, I won't point you to them, thing papers that I managed to get published. And, it was fine. And I think I was in graduate school. My advisor is a guy named David Nassau, who he wrote a lot of biographies. And so he sort of turned into writing trade books and serious trade books, well researched. He wasn't just churning them out, but he encouraged me to write a dissertation that was readable from the beginning and that one that I could more easily turn into a book. And so that I owe him a lot of credit for not demanding chapter upon chapter of historiography, the kind of things that get cut from books or that tend to bore readers. And yeah, the book actually, like those first two books, I also wanted them to be readable and thought there would be some lay interest from people who are just into bicycling. But I also, as I've each book have gotten enjoyed the process of writing more and more and have let go a desire to sound smart or make some contribution and have leaned more into trying to tell a compelling story that is both educational and not boring to read. Um, and yeah, so, and when I started writing this book, I initially wasn't sure if it was going to be an academic book publisher or a trade publisher. And I went back because I had published two university press books to those editors, and they wanted it, they were interested. And they were so interested that my wife said, well, wait, maybe you should, see if you can get an agent. Like, this is happening very fast and they're offering you, money to do this. And it just seemed like maybe there was something there. So I just cold queried a bunch of agents and somehow got one, and it just worked out. And it seemed very surprising because I know how hard it can be to do. And writing the book really wasn't that much different, just if I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but because I'm talking to a bunch of academics, I will say Viking, as I mentioned, never asked me to get rid of or condense the end notes. They're invisible in the text. They're these lead line notes that takes a few extra seconds to find them. But nobody ever said you can't spend 5 years working on this book and you can't include all these sources and you should just kind of whip something up. So there's still, I think, a vibrant place. It's small, but it's vibrant for serious nonfiction trade books, by people like us that can cross over.
I think, yeah, I was thinking about this in the context. I don't want to move on to other people's questions, but I know I'm going to invoke the review, the New Yorker review, which I know a few of us have read that I particularly don't like. And I read it again yesterday and like it even less. So for those who are not familiar, Louis Banan wrote a review in the New Yorker, and it's actually hard to call it a review of your book. Uh, it mentions your book, but it seems to be some kind of screed about how, or I don't know, something about his memories of book shopping. But he kind of places himself kind of firmly in the camp of thinking of bookshops as distributors, as like places of purchase. And just to be clear, what I mean by this not being a review, I actually I did a word count. So the entire piece is 4,279 words. And this is generous. Any sentence that involved any mention of your book directly, because I think he borrows a lot of your structure. It doesn't credit you.
Yes.
But any only totaled to 464 words. So I feel kind of it's like an unfair to you. I feel I don't know why I'm so defensive on your behalf,
Well,
but
I appreciate that.
it's kind of, it just annoyed me as a review. But he kind of, he does, because of that fixation, he's like, he's only seemingly thinking about the economic dimensions, to
Mhm.
bookshops, or it seems that that's where we should be thinking. But how would you argue with him, or at least with such a unidimensional idea of bookselling? So maybe not so much about him, but just like
Yeah.
that idea.
Yeah. Well, I think the title for when it first appeared online was something like "Should bookstores even exist?" or
Yeah.
something like that. And I was like, all right. When I saw that title, I was rolling my eyes, like, what the? I mean, I was like, this is the in the New Yorker of all, publications. Like, I think your readers have an answer to that question. It's pretty, obvious. Um, well, I will say, first of all, generally, and you can stop me if I'm broadening out too much, but it's a privilege to have your book reviewed in so many places, and many of us are desperate for attention and people to be reading our stuff. And so on the first and foremost, I'm very happy that the New Yorker paid it any attention and that he read it and thought about it. And, I'm sure some people bought the book as a result, even if the review wasn't much a review or wasn't very positive. And one of the most interesting things, and this happens a bit in that review, is that my book, and I'll try and spin this as a compliment to myself, is that a lot of the reviews are in fact the reviewer using it as an opportunity to talk about their own history with bookstores, that it seems to invite them to take them on their own journey and personal history. And they sort of frequently move off the topic from reviewing the book to this kind of them trying to reflect on and understand what bookstores have meant to them personally, which again, I take positively and nice. And I think is a, and some of the nicest kind of fan mail I've gotten has been in that same vein of like, this felt like walking into my bookstore and it brought back all these memories. So there's a little bit of that in the review, and that's why he moves off my book, which is also, by the way, if you haven't read it, paired with James Patterson. So back to the other question about writing an academic book. And again, this book doesn't feel to me that different than my first two books, but now I'm in a paired review with James Patterson. It was pretty hilarious. But obviously I just I mean, he wanted more about the economic dimension of the business, which I think is a legitimate criticism. And it's not that I wasn't aware. I mean, first of all, when you go to an archive of a bookstore that has any material left over, much of it is financial. And I have thousands of PDFs worth of receipts and inventories and all sorts of financial records that when I was doing the research thought was going to be a more robust part of the book. But for a variety of reasons, wasn't a kind of the major thread of trying to sort of understand how profitable Gotham Book Mart was in like a given year. Just didn't seem to really register with the note I was trying to hit in that chapter about how vital this space was. So I think he does talk a bit about it in the review, but I think my book is trying to say that there is this tension between making money and these other values, social, cultural worth that these places provide. And I think I do highlight that tension repeatedly, even if I don't get into the kind of weeds about the economics of running a bookstore. And much of what my bookstore is about is what he sort of minimized is this experience that is not just a transactional place. And he starts the review by saying, I could get this book. You know, he's a professor at Harvard on Amazon. Why do I have to go deal with the annoying Harvard kids or, you know, whatever? He's sort of, I think, he's representative of a lot of people who don't go to bookstores or don't love bookstores. And I understand that perspective, but there are also many others who think of bookstores in a much less transactional way. And I try and highlight those stories and those values and that worth over time in different bookstores.
I I I remember professors like this guy. I worked at a bookstore in Buffalo that Evan also knows called Talking Leaves, and they had strong academic customer base, and there were definitely professors like Manon's who'd come in and be like completely frustrated that we weren't stocking in a very obscure text.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And
just
I thought the review, like, I thought he hated the book. And then online they have a best books of the week and there's only like 6 or 7 books and mine was one of them and I was like so confused. I was like, does the New Yorker hate me or love me? um because he seemed to hate me, and then I didn't know if that was like other people pushing back on his review, you know, because they of course have the leeway to write whatever they want, but it appeared like simultaneous was his snarky review and then my book in their, you know, roundup for the best book. It's still on there. They have like a best book of the year. They just add a handful every week. Like, okay. So
I want to get to the chat. There's some comments in the chat. But before that, I was wondering, this is shifting gears just a little bit, but I wanted to get it in there. Could you share with the group a little bit about parentheses books?
yeah, so my wife, who worked at Three Lives for 8.5 years and was the genesis for this project and idea, and I was in grad school, and I don't know why it took me so long to write this book, but that was a while ago. was thinking about opening her own bookstore. And I started this book before she, people would ask her, why don't you open a bookstore in our college town of Harrisonburg, which has a Barnes and Noble, but hasn't had an indie bookstore in a long time. And for a variety of reasons, she began to seriously consider it. And so her bookshop, basically, she opened a bookstore here in town. And it's not in the book because I sort of handed in the manuscript before it actually opened. She's in the book, and a lot of the interviews have focused on this. But there was an interesting couple of years where she was plotting to open a bookstore, and I was writing the history of the American bookstore. So we're a very bookstore centric family, and people would ask me as a so-called expert on the subject if she was crazy for opening a bookstore. Um, that was the kind of most common thread. And now that she's opened the bookstore, I've learned so much more about book selling now that the book is, locked in and in print because I do sometimes work there and pull a shift and I'd have some other additions and things to say. One thing, and she obviously carries my book and it's very prominently placed. And it's very weird when a person who doesn't know me just picks it up and comes to the register. And I don't know what to say, to say anything. And I feel kind of creepy about ringing them up. But
I'll embrace it.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I guess if people, we do have questions in the chat, but if people want to kind of unmute and ask as well, you're most welcome to. Um, but I'm going to start with Miriam's question and the top one on the in the chat, um, who asks, "Do you see bookstores evolving in the same way that libraries evolve? Are they also serving the same purposes?"
So, at least in the US, when libraries first became popular in the late 19th century, they were very much seen as a rival to bookstores, and booksellers and the various trade groups tried to basically put them out or resist them in many ways. And libraries proved to be less of a threat than initially conceived of, and many bookstores began having their own circulating libraries as part of their bookstores, and that petered out by the middle of the 20th century. But now I think at least like by the 90s and even more so today, once the corporate chains got so big and then Amazon, bookstores and libraries, I don't think have ever been more allied and cooperative because they see themselves as trying to promote many of the same things. And there are many libraries that will bring in authors and have the local bookshop sell copies at the place and co-promote various kind of groups and talks and literacy in a variety of ways. And both, I think, have tried to reinvent themselves in some similar ways of attracting different kinds of audiences. How do you get people into a library who maybe aren't the kind of hardcore print readers? And this is the same thing for bookstores that have had to dance faster and faster. And you see this at least in the American context with different kinds of events, not just author talks and books, but other ways of inviting people in, and libraries reimagining their missions to be not just places where people can find books, but as community gathering spots.
Uh, Next question is from John. Hi, John. Haven't seen you in a while. He's an old friend of mine. Uh, Very good bookseller. So John asks, as to Steloff and Rodwell, in some ways, or do you want to ask this yourself, John? I don't know if you
Yeah,
want
yeah, sure.
to. Okay.
And I'm so glad this is during my free period as a teacher because I'm in school. Yeah, like how did like Rodwell and why am I blanking on the
Steloff?
yeah, Steloff and even Harold Monroe, like they're the, Monroe's a poet, but I mean these two people who are not necessarily super readers, um, involving themselves in owning a bookstore or doing something with a bookstore that's like part of like this bigger cultural project. And as a bookseller myself as well as a teacher, um, it's like it's that idea of like there ought to be this thing here, right? There ought to be a thing in the community that exists, and which is I think a big part of like the mid-century cultural phenomenon of like what ought to like what makes a smart person or what makes a sophisticated person, and what makes a an educated person, even if you're not them. Like the world of like encyclopedias and all those mid-century kind of magazines and the great books thing of the mid-century,
Mm.
where it's like people join this cultural project of understanding that this is what makes a culture worthwhile, and and kind of runs counter to that discussion in the New Yorker article, right? About like why does a bookstore even need to exist? It kind of needs to exist for more than just the books or the transaction of selling the books, but like looking at the anti-racist books in Paget's bookstore, even though you're not going to read them because you're maybe racist, but like this, I don't know, I just it's been bugging me for years, like this idea of like what ought to be an educated person, which we don't get at much anymore. It's kind of we're losing that focus as a culture. It's becoming more atomized, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. As somebody who now spends a lot of time in my wife's bookstore, this is hard to kind of articulate or quantify, but there are people who just walk in who don't buy a book. They're waiting for a table at the lunch place across the street. And I just see this still as a great like experience for them. And it reads, they're like walking in, they're not going to buy anything. They don't buy anything, but they walk in, they're kind of enamored by the space there. They talk about it, and it serves this function, that way. I think that you're talking about, and
That
it's
was
still
that,
a cultural exposure
that was
that's
my
healthy.
parents. When I was a kid, I mean, my parents had Reader's Digest books and an encyclopedia, and I never saw either of them crack a book in my life.
Yeah.
But they knew it was important, and it's that sort of macro message that institutions like libraries and bookstores, which is why they're kind of coming together, um, have to say that this is an important project to read and be read. Where Steloff is supporting the Joyce, even though she doesn't get it. Where the Oscar Wilde guy is like, it's not my thing, but I know that it's a place we need these things. People need to
Mhm.
see the books. I mean, that itself is a particular interaction that bookstores have that, of course, Amazon or any online experience won't have. That they're just there, they exist. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so Barbara, it's not a question, she has an offer. There's a photo of Christopher Morley breaking a bottle of Cutty Sark over the bow of the bookshop's new curriculum bookmobile. She's willing to share it if you haven't seen it.
Okay. It's in the book.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. I thought it sounded familiar.
Yeah. It's a great photo. I have it right here.
Yeah, oh,
You can, a little hard to see, but he's
motivation for people to buy the book.
Christopher Morley is one of these people that I really didn't know much about before I started doing this book, and he shows up everywhere. He's like the bookstore guy, not just because of Parness on Wheels, but he's great friends with Francis Steloff. He's very good friends with the woman who's in charge of Marshall Field book department. He briefly works at the old corner after it's not really the old corner anymore, but this guy is everywhere in sort of book selling for 50 years.
Yeah, it's kind of a
And
legend. Oh, Barbara,
and
go ahead.
Evan, I'll add the founder of the Baker Street Irregulars.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So he's
Yeah,
writing.
thanks for for showing me the photo. I had only briefly gotten to thumb through your book when it arrived a few days ago, and didn't realize you had that in there. Kudos.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to digress about morally, but I won't. One can. Megan, you have your hand up?
Hi, yes. Sorry, my connection is not that great. I was wondering if you found anything about the American United States factors that were unique to, let me reverse that. Anything about the bookstores that was unique in an American context that seemed distinctive?
Yeah, so writing about America seemed like a huge, broad topic. So I try to keep my blinders on in terms of what's happening around the world, although that's an interest of mine. I will say at least part of the kind of narrative thread within the bookselling profession has long been that American bookstores are disadvantaged compared to European bookstores because American culture is just not as intellectual, or that there aren't these same kind of cultural traditions. So, it shows up on and off again throughout the kind of book. And in terms of the earliest bookstores, of course, it takes a long time for American literature to even come to fruition, and everybody wants to read non-American authors, which is the great literature, all the way up to indie booksellers and the American Booksellers Association looking to models like France and other countries that have tried to limit Amazon's market share in a variety of ways that the United States hasn't done. So I think, again, this isn't a very specific answer because I don't know enough about bookselling cultures around the world, but there's a sense that, like, in the most capitalistic place on earth, America, and not necessarily the most intellectual place on earth, that bookstores have had not unique challenges, but that some of the challenges elsewhere have hit harder in the US. And there's some in the book, Manan must not have read these parts about discounting and, long lobbying about standard discounts and whether or not retailers can control the price of the book and publishers putting the price on the book, and various efforts to lobby from the 19th century to the New Deal to the FTC today. So I think there's a sense that the American booksellers are less potent than many other groups, and that the government is sort of less willing to take them on as a cultural product that they need to preserve.
Interesting. Thank you.
Eleanor?
Yes, okay.
Trying to
Sorry, I'm
unmute.
just looking at the chat.
My mute button was hidden.
Okay.
I think your last answer probably answered the question that I had, but I remember as a little girl going into department stores and spending time with my father in the book department while my mother shopped. I mean, I spent 5-6 years. And I also know I have a collection of about 800 family book titles from a woman that got her interest in books by working in a bookshop and book department within the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania trade.
Okay.
And I'm wondering why department stores, because they carry so much, did you get a sense of why they stopped putting books in department stores? Was it really because they found no interest in the American public, or?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, places like Marshall Field, which I highlight, but other leading department stores, were very luxury oriented spaces. They catered to what was called the carriage trade and wealthy buyers. And there was some discussion, and maybe I should have gotten more into this, and Anne would have been happier about whether or not the books were sort of lost leaders for these department stores, like people have long said about Amazon, right? That they were a way to get people in the door, but that they were hardly the most profitable items in these luxurious department stores that are selling furniture and clothes and other things that have much higher markups. But that said, books in the 1920s, and Marshall Field had also high-end books with, fancy bindings, and they sold rare books as well as books that were bestsellers. So it was an elevated space, and the books as kind of material objects added to that and added to this luxury brand. Over the course of the 20th century, as surely you all are aware, we have mass market paperbacks and the democratization of books, and some of the things that John was referring to about books as kind of needed for middle class discernment, and to be this middle class American, you needed to be familiar with certain titles. So books get cheapened in a way. And what happens at Marshall Fields and others is they start to try and cater to some of these more discount buyers, and they lose their allure as these more like high-end luxurious places. And it matches what's happening to the department stores anyway. They go from these spaces that are ornate, high-end, to kind of middle market, and then the next iteration is Kmart and Target and all the rest. And that's kind of the evolution or devolution. So the books are following these brands that are losing a lot of their luster. So the book departments are less necessary. And in many ways, the department stores themselves become less necessary, or certainly much less anchors than they were as kind of these important cultural tastemakers throughout the 20th century.
I want to squeeze in one.
Are you in
Oh, sorry.
Harrisburg? Sorry. There was some reference to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
She's in DC.
Oh, DC. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in DC. I didn't grow up in Harrisburg. I just got, there was a collection of 800 titles owned by a family with a lot of
Oh,
things
okay.
about books. And the main woman who collected them, she ended up becoming a librarian after working in the book department at this department store in Harrisburg. And,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
my stores were in Philadelphia, Wanamaker's, Gimbel's, the whole gamut.
And Julie says in the chat that Target and Costco's going to stop selling books supposedly, but are huge sellers of books. And she's exactly right. It's sort of moved from department stores, high-end department stores, then sort of middle grade department stores, to now the next evolution is Target selling these books.
I think we have, I want to squeeze in one more question before we wrap things up. Will, you had a question, right?
Oh, thanks. I have got hold of your book, got a copy here. And I'm really loving what I've read so far. And I'm really interested in the premise, particularly the shout out to the UPS driver early on, I think, and the world of Three Lives as a bookstore, because one of the things I keep wondering about, which is probably being on the border of being an academic and a bookseller, is wondering about the essentials that happen within the book trade that can support a bookstore like Three Lives existing. So it doesn't have to be doing events, it doesn't have to be doing a large amount of things, and it has a space in a neighborhood, it has custom, it has a good deal on space and rent, it can work like that. But are there, at the end of this kind of study, things where you think, the book trade's activities in promotion, in or the logistics of book supply, they need to happen to keep kind of bookstores open? Are there essential things kind of off stage from the theater of the bookshop that nonetheless feed into it powerfully and that kind of are almost inseparable from the work we do existing? I think that being in a small bookshop that's been here a century and wondering how are we still going, and it is probably from our angle that book promotion is still working really, really well, right? We get the new books in and they work, but I wonder whether there are kind of specific things you think still need to happen within the book trade to keep bookstores afloat and opening and operating.
Yeah. I mean, you might have a better answer to that question than I would as a historian, but I think it's an important point. And just as somebody who has a book that just came out, and my public, I've been very lucky. I have no complaints. My book was reviewed in the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Washington Post and, everywhere one could hope. But that world is still so much smaller than it used to be. And there are so many fewer people who are reading the New York Times book review than there used to be, and all the other ones. So what it even means to get that kind of buzz or cultural kind of play is is harder and harder in this fractured world. So yeah, everybody knows Sally Rooney just came out with a book. At least in the US, it came out Tuesday. But that's a hard thing to do, to like get that word out. Increasingly hard when people aren't, there's just no kind of publication that has the same sway as it used to in terms of literature. So that's an ongoing challenge. Even if there are different ways, people are going online or TikTok, but it's still, I don't think, the same as it was. Um, and also, as being married to a bookseller, what's fascinating is, and this makes a real difference, what the discount is from the different publishers, and how many of the which ones are reliable, and the shipping times, and what happens when a big book is supposed to land and you don't get the books in time and you miss this. It really makes a difference to an operation that exists on such a thin line. These kind of small things that are outside of the bookseller's control and that are decided by these ever bigger corporate entities. And like when I was shopping, or when I got an agent and then she shopped around the book, it didn't make any difference to me. I mean, I wanted a big publisher and figured that, a big publisher would have more weight and the book could be found more, but it didn't matter to me whether it was Penguin Random House or Simon and Schuster or Harper or whatever. But now that my wife owns a bookstore, it matters to me because I see what their interfaces are like for her, and how easy it is to say that there's a damaged copy, and how reliable and how fast they will come. So
I think we're losing people, so I want to maybe take the moment to
that happens whenever I start talking.
it's okay. I think I want to thank you very much for your time and for your very interesting insights and for your book, Evan. Um, uh, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Such a warm and bright crowd. I appreciate it.
So Evan, where are you exactly, by the way?